Creating your own card game can be a fun and rewarding experience, but it can also be quite difficult at times. There are a lot of systems that need to work together, and sometimes it can be hard to keep track of it all. The Cards of Card Games is a model you can use to structure your card game design and help make it more accessible to work with. It is designed to keep the natural flow of card games into consideration, splitting it up into just 5 categories, making it both easy to remember and follow. This does not mean you need to design your card game in this order. You will definitely jump back and forth between these categories as you design your card game. Now, we will be covering quite a few aspects of card game design today. However, we won't delve too deep into them at this time, so do keep an eye out for videos on these topics in the future. You can always subscribe and ring the bell if you want to get notified whenever I upload a new video. Alright then, let's get started. So the first letter in cards is C, and that is for collection. As a new player, you'd need some cards to get started. So that is where you can already ask yourself the question, so how will your game get distributed? So when it comes to distributing your game, there is basically 2 kinds of products. There's randomized products and non-randomized products. When it comes to randomized products, you have the booster packs, which is usually known in trading card games, the CCGs, but you also have something like unique decks in the unique deck games, such as Keyforge. So when it comes to non-randomized products, you would have something like the starter decks, but you would also have, like, if you buy a box of cards where you always get the same, so a non-randomized pack of cards. These are very common in expandable card games, which is basically where you remove the randomization of boosters, and you just, whatever you see is what you get. Now, a collection would cover quite a few different aspects of collecting. So these would be something like distribution, so we already covered that. But it would also be something like the release schedule. It would cover rotation, if your game has rotation. Rarity, if your game has boosters, you would need sometimes different kind of rarities, which would also include something like chase cards or foils. Any kind of product types would also go under this category, such as boosters, starter decks, core sets, expansions, and so on. So basically, everything that goes into distributing your card game from a wide scope to a narrow scope would go into the collection category. So let's say your players now got a starter deck each, and they crack open the pack and they are ready to play. The first thing they need to know is how to win the game. So that is where A in cards comes in. That is the aim. So it's quite important to let your players know how to actually win the game as soon as possible. As a new player especially, you can imagine that card games can be a little bit hard to get into. There's a lot of mechanics to learn. So knowing how to win the game gives perspective to the rest of the rules. Now, when it comes to winning the game, there's really only 2 different kind of categories, but they can be done in a lot of different ways. So these 2 categories are basically a value to defend and a value to obtain. So the value to defend is probably the most common one. That's when you have some sort of value, usually health points, which when you reach 0, you lose the game. So again, this can be done in a few different ways. So you can either have the player themselves having this life total, or you could have it in a card form. So for example, a hero or leader card, or a base or something like that you need to defend. That is like physically on the table. Even something like a deck out would go under this category because you have a set amount of cards, 40, 50 or 60 cards in your deck, and when it reaches 0, you lose the game. Now, the opposite of this would be the value to obtain. And it's not as widespread as the value to defend, but it is starting to see a little bit more popularity. So value to obtain is basically the opposite. It's where you start at 0 and need to build your way up towards a goal. This can also be done in quite a few different ways, but it's basically victory points. You need to amass a certain amount before you then win the game. So of course you can have multiple different win conditions, but usually you have one main one. And that's where you can then ask yourself the question if you would like to have the value to defend, so like a health pool, or if you want to go with victory points, so the value to obtain. So the aim is not only the end destination, but also how you get there. So the road to victory, so to speak. And that is where deck building also comes in under this category. This would cover something like factions or colors, archetypes, traits, strategies, aggro, combo, control, and mid-range, for example. So as you can see, aim is also where we cover the different combination of cards that can create certain strategies. So this is where you create the variance within the game. So to make sure that not every game plays out exactly the same. Players will have different decks with different strategies. So overall, aim is where you put everything that has to do with winning the game and how to get there. So now the players know how to win the game and they're getting ready to play. So the next thing they need to know is the economy of the game. So that is where R for resources comes in. So with resources, we have 2 overall categories. We have the price tag and what I like to call the terms and conditions. So the price tag is probably the most common one. That is where you exchange some sort of currency for cards and card effects. That could be mana or gold or energy or whatever you want to call it. On the other hand, we have the terms and conditions. And that is where you set some sort of restriction on how you can play the card. That is not tied to a currency, so to speak. This can be anything from discarding a card, sacrificing a card, milling cards, removing cards from your graveyard, controlling specific card types, and so on and so forth. You get the picture. So of course you can go as much or as little into these two different kind of categories, and there's a lot of different variations within these two categories that you can design your game around. So some games will be using one more than the other, but most games will be somewhere in between. So now you can ask yourself the question, how do you generate resources in your card game? How many cards do you get to draw in the beginning of the turn, which, by the way, is also a resource, and how to fulfill terms and conditions within your card game. Now, as mentioned, there's quite a few variations within these two categories. You can have resource cards in the deck, you can have a separate resource card deck, you can have each card be a resource in itself, you can automatically gain max resources each turn, or you can gain a set amount of resources at the beginning of each turn. There's of course many more ways of doing this, but it's fun to explore. So another thing we have under the resource category would be balance, so balancing of your game. It's basically because it's the resources that determine which power level comes at which cost. This is of course to try and minimize the impact of power creep to make sure everything plays out roughly the same. So resources is all about the economy of your card game. Right, so now that the players knows the requirements and how to play their cards, they need to know to where and when, which leads us to deployment. The D in cards is for deployment. And deployment is basically the core gameplay loop of your game. That's when we start to get into the actual gameplay of your card game. So again, we have basically two categories here, and that is where and when. So where can the players play their cards? That would be the layout of your playing field. This would include the zones in which the players can play their cards in. So when it comes to zones, most card game has like 3 or 4 maybe core zones, but then some games also likes to delve even deeper into it. So some of the common ones would be something like the deck, the discard pile, the hand, the playing field, remove from play, and then of course you could have some card specific zones if there are some unique type of cards that only goes into specific zones. That's where you would include this. You'd basically be designing the layout of the playing field in this category. Now the players also need to know when they can play their cards. This usually comes in either turns, phases, and rounds, or a mixture of any of these really. So for turns, that's usually when the player gets to play a card, you could have a few different ways of doing this. The players could be allowed to do just one action per turn. It could be that they can do maybe a few actions, but quite limited. Or as many as desired, or that they can afford to with the resource system. So when it comes to phases, you can have them either within turns or outside of turns. Phases usually come in a few different variations, but it all depends on your game. This could be the beginning phase where you draw cards, you untap or ready your cards, and that is where any at the beginning of your turn effects would happen. You would have some sort of main phase where you can play cards. You would have maybe a combat phase where you can attack and interact with your opponent. And you would have an end phase where any end of turn effects would go off. Sometimes you may see multiples of the same phase, such as the main phase, or the beginning phase might be split up into multiple parts. Now this would be the same for both phases within and outside of turns. So the outside of turns would be similar, but usually with a back and forth system, so where the actual turn actions would be limited to just one or a few actions. Now the last part would be rounds. Rounds are usually a way to structure the back and forth gameplay so that when you have only one or a few actions you can do, you go back and forth taking a turn, just performing that one action for example, until both players passes, and that would be the end of the round. This gives a natural refresh state where you can draw cards and gain resources and ready all your cards. So basically, deployment is where you put anything that has to do with the setup of the game and structuring of the game. So now that the players know where and when to play their cards, the one thing that is left to explore is how the players get to interact with their opponents. This leads us to the S in cards, which is the struggle. So unless you want a solitaire kind of game with no interaction between players, you would need rules for the players on how they can interact with each other. This is usually done in some sort of combat system, but also in how you can react or respond to your opponent's cards. But it could also just be the back and forth between players. So if players are only allowed to take one action at a time, there will be a lot more ability to respond to each other's actions, rather than just having one turn where you can do everything and then the opponent have to deal with that. So when it comes to combat, you need to know which kind of attack system you want for your game. So one of the more popular ones is where you just target the enemy player. This could be with one unit or creature at a time, or it could be where you declare all of your attackers and then the opponent gets to block. You could also have a system where you allow your cards to attack individual cards on the field or the enemy player, so you get to decide which card you attack. It could be that you can only attack tapped units, or it could be that you can attack any unit. Then you need to decide if the enemy can block, and you need to decide if you would have any sort of combat tricks that could be activated at this time. You would also need to find out how damage calculation works. So Do the units deal damage to each other at the same time? Or do the attacker deal first, and then if the defender survives, then they retaliate? Or is it that only the attacker deals damage? Within the struggle, you would also need to find out how responses would work. So that usually comes down to if you want to counter an enemy card, or if you have some sort of reaction to an enemy card. It's also where you would need to find out the exact rules for how your stack or chain would work when it comes to players activating cards back and forth in response to each other. So how do they resolve? Another thing I would advise you to keep in mind when it comes to the struggle between players is the player's ability to bluff. Being able to bluff would add a lot of mind gaming to your game, which can be a fun experience for some people. So with the struggle, you would put anything that has to do with the interaction between players, so what they can do and what they cannot do. Now the players know how to interact with each other and can now play through their first game. After they're done with the game, they can easily loop back to the collection, and they can look at ways to expand their collection, explore new decks and strategies, and delve even further into the rules of the game. And with that, you now know how you can structure your game with the cards model, and you can keep adding to these 5 categories as you keep designing your game. If you found this video useful, please consider giving it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more card game design videos. You may also enjoy one of these videos. Until next time.